Thank you. Thanks for the intro. So I'll show you like two sides of a phenomenon, a physical phenomenon that happens in volatile memory. Volatile memory, even though they are supposed to forget things, sometimes they remember stuff, and it gives you opportunity to do stuff. And also, if it remembers information beyond a certain time, that's a security risk. So there will be two basically main projects that I'll be talking about here. If you have any question, we'll have Q&A later in the session. All right, cool. So quickly about me, I'm part of Lucid's red team now. I just defended, as was mentioned, my doctoral defense. And I am interested in three broad area: hardware-oriented system security, cloud FPGA security, basically low-level stuff like how analog-level problems can become system-level security challenges, and then fake chip detection, anti-counterfeiting framework. I also worked on those areas as well. These are some of the ways you can reach me. That'll take you to my academic website and LinkedIn X, whatever, and unfortunately probably Instagram. I should change that handle. Okay, so quick disclaimer, the content of this presentation is purely from my doctoral research at Virginia Tech. It contains no proprietary information and does not reflect the opinions and positions of Lucid. Oh, that's out of the way. Cool. So volatile memory, like the one that you see over there, the DRAM, technically should forget its content as soon as you turn it off, but it doesn't. The data is stored there for a little bit right after power down. So that gives us opportunity to sort of design various stuff like batteryless timekeeping and random number generation, crypto key generation, as well as, of course, attacks too. I'll be talking about SRAM, just broadly, and not broadly, specifically, which is the most common on-chip memory that you'll see. These are cache main memory for microcontrollers and scratchpad RAM for various other processors. The coolest thing about them is that this little structure here, inverter 1 and 2, they keep the data into this positive feedback loop. It doesn't require any refreshing. They're ultra fast. From security angle, startup state. That's what we're interested in. This is, if you have a bunch of SRAM cells and if you turn it on, some of those cells will be 1, some of those cells will be 0, and they're spatially sort of scattered everywhere. That's kind of the baseline. This is kind of the effect that SRAM physical and clonable function exploits. This will be our canvas for most of the things. First thing that I'll talk about, the one side of sort of this remnants behavior, is designing sort of covert communication channel, plausibly deniable information transfer channel using this remnants behavior. So I call it invisible bits. So why would you want to hide information? And formally it's called steganography. Why would you do that? To sort of bring all you in. Here's Agent 007. He is obviously smuggling information out of a country, and border guard, they're not going to allow, right? So they're going to ask for the password and he's not going to give it. And then you finally basically do what you want to do. So it is a thing, right? Coercing someone to give away information is the weakest link. You can basically torture someone to give away the password. That's where steganography comes in. You actually hide the information in such a way someone can't really prove that you have information. So that's plausibly deniable channel, right? All right. So the threat model was Alice wants to talk to Bob, and the channel needs to be plausibly deniable. An adversary can copy, inspect, overwrite, erase, and do all kinds of mathematical digital forensic on it. All right. So here's a sneak peek. This is Mona Lisa. And this is SRAM's power and state, random looking ones and zeros that we have talked about. after encoding or hiding, this random looking canvas will turn into a messages, a structure. And when the processor or microcontroller, whatever the SRAM is, when it's going to boot, if you read that before writing anything to it, you'll see that message. And it's entirely in hardware. It's not really stored anywhere else. So if you look at the structure again, the two inverters sort of back-to-back connected in a positive feedback loop, and they're by design symmetric. And what happens during startup, they go through a race condition to sort of latch onto 1 or 0, and that's what stores until you turn it off again. So if A wins the race condition, you get logic 1 in that cell. If B wins, the opposite happens. And if you go down the abstraction layer a little bit, you'll see that if you store 1, if the cell powers on into 1, for example, and if you keep it this way for a long, long time, probably 20 years, this bit will change the analog structure, analog characteristics of this cell in such a way that subsequent power on state will tell you what was stored in there. But again, the time frame is very long, and we can't really wait that long, right? Again, we don't have to worry too much about this little simulation diagram, but we store 1 in there, and the other node becomes 0, and that sort of ages transistor M4. It slows down, so the inverter's characteristic changes, and so the race condition also changes. As a result, finally, when you later down the line, when you read that cell's value, you can sort of infer what was stored in there. So that's how we sort of change the race condition in analog way. All right. So the sort of it's a high level takeaway is that if you store 1 in there, you're going to get 0 later. So kind of in a negative burn-in effect. It's like that old film camera. But there is a way to accelerate this aging process to encode information in there. We don't have to really wait 20 years. If you exploit the physics a little bit, here's the cell, and you expose this cell, throw it in the oven in a higher temperature. Don't burn it, of course, like 80 C is sufficient. And drive off the voltage a little bit. So what happens is that it accelerates the aging process, because the underlying physics, the negative bias temperature instability, the reason why transistor slows down, accelerates, and this PMOS, the sort of that their behavior changes, their turn on time, the speed reduces over time. So elevated voltage, elevated temperature. Use these two knobs, so you can reduce the encoding time significantly. In fact, a couple hours. That's sufficient. All right, so now we have methods to, this is sort of the basic how you encode information. And this is all real silicon data. All right, so let's encode 1 bit of information. It doesn't really change with the size of the message. You just store the message, the process remains same. We want to encode logic 1 in this particular cell. So we store 1, the other node automatically becomes 0, and we throw it in the oven after sort of elevating the voltage, nominal voltage of it, and then we wait. This changes the race condition so that inverter B is going to win now. Inverter A is going to lose. So that cell is going to power on into logic 0 because M4 is slow now. It can't really win the race condition anymore. Cool. So that's how we encode information. All right. So this is the process. Now I obviously have to ask, is it possible to is it error-free? Can we really change all the cell's analog characteristics? And the next question is, if someone inspects the device, is he going to figure that out? Are they going to figure that there is some information hidden in there? right? Two main questions for steganograph, of course. So let's start with the first one. All right. Here are some examples chips that I used for hiding information. This particular slide does not contain any error correction code. So raw message goes into the SRAM cell and we expose it to aging. And of course, datasheet and experiment guide you which voltage and which temperature you need. For most of the experiments, I just used standard 85C. But for voltage, you have to know the datasheet, what is the operating temperature, operating voltage of that particular chip is, and how much you actually can elevate. Because, well, one end is you're going to smoke the whole device. The other end is just going to operate normally. So there is a spectrum there we have to sort of sweep through. All right, so this is the raw accuracy of hidden information after retrieval. It ranges from 79 to 97% depending on what chip you're using. Newer devices respond better, older devices not so much, simply because they're just not sensitive to aging as much as the newer ones. So, but we can't really hide information. For example, you can't really hide your crypto wallet in there with error in it. So we need to have some kind of error correction mechanism, and it depends on your error tolerance, of course. To guide on that, I just use simple ECC there. Consider, okay, ignore that. Here is Mona Lisa again. On the left side, right side, I guess, not so pretty. And as we increase the sort of number of bits to represent one bit, you'll see that she becomes prettier. So when we want to store information, we can use multiple bits to represent one bit. Mathematically, that's just Hamming code, repetition code. So that's one way to reduce the error. And on top of that, depending on what message you are storing, you can use advanced error correction mechanism if you want to. By doing that, theoretically, if you add more copies, the error will be 0. I mean, close to 0, unless you want to use higher code rate ECC like Hamming 741, just layering on top of it. Okay, so the second question, very important one, is our agent 77 safe? Can we really figure that out, whether the information is hidden there or not? Well, first of all, the information is not really stored anywhere, right? I didn't store it in a flash. I didn't store it anywhere. It's just encoded in the hardware layer. And as soon as system boots, cache or main memory, they're pretty much going to be erased by the system data, right? So it's not really stored there. And the second thing is that system, yes, it's free to use the entire SRAM. It'll not change. I have slides later, but it's not in the main sort of presentation. I did experiment to see what is the error tolerance, what kind of system operation I can run on it, so that the error remains within certain tolerance. Actually, the system's data written on top of the SRAM doesn't really change much, the encoded information. If you're interested, we can talk about that later. But as you might guess, if you look at the power on state, it will give away that, hey, the typical statistical property changed. If you look at an SRAM, you'll see the power on state stays within, say, 50% of them approximately will be 1 and other 50% will be 0. But as soon as you store some message in there, it changes the statistical property. So that gives away that there is hidden message in there, obviously. But if you remember that the power on state is sort of largely random and you destroy the message's structure with encryption and then you encode it, that brings the whole encrypted, even encoded device's characteristics closer to a clean device. So now, even if someone looks at the power on state, they can't really figure out that something is hidden there. So that also gives us protection from sort of a little bit of stricter adversary if someone looks at the sort of power on state as well. Here's a full system that I implemented. It has typical crypto stuff. It has error correction in the message, and then we run it through a counter mode AES because we need to have error tolerance there. If it is a block cipher, it's going to destroy even if there is a single bit error. So we had to choose that. And the decoding mechanism is just the opposite of encryption because it's symmetric. And there are other evaluation I ran on this. For example, what is the cause of the error? Why can't we encode the whole message? And then what happens if we let the device sit? Because aging related changes, they kind of recover a little bit. So I had to study that as well. And then what happens if an adversary takes multiple snapshots? They read the power on state now and they read the power on state 20 hours from now. What happens? Does it change? But none of these actually affect the overall performance of the system. So that's the first part of the work, one side of the remnants. The second one is an attack one on trusted execution environment. All right, so the main two takeaways from the previous one are obviously, well, one, SRAM's power bus, even in a complex processor, is accessible. And stored data in the SRAM can direct the power on state. So there is influence. And we take these two main takeaways and sort of build an attack on state-of-the-art trusted execution environment like ARM Trust Zone because they're just everywhere, easily accessible. All right, if you just look at the sort of laying on the bigger picture here, as hardware become sort of more complex and feature rich, is also become vulnerable because we have just so many layers to sort of keep track on. And as software security, they're doing a great job of strengthening the overall system security. But that also means hacking is sort of going down. We're looking at the lower levels now. Every layer of the hardware, we have attacks. We're seeing more and more. And in fact, if you look at this World Economic Forum's statement that basically says, well, hardware is the bedrock of digital trust. Is compromised, we have problems. So we got to strengthen those, right? Some of the some of the prevention mechanism for off-chip attacks, physical attacks, that you encrypt everything that goes out of an SoC, out of a processor, and keep the data in the on-chip SRAM, even lock part of the cache so that the data can stay there. But if you need to put anything out of the chip, just use the memory controller's transparent encryption mechanism. That helps. That's awesome. And in fact, if you enforce trusted execution type environment like T, if you change the security attribute of a specific memory, is going to erase it before releasing its control to non-secure world. So just high-level trust zone, what that is it's just a way to create hardware-backed isolation. You have one physical processor, but it creates two virtual processors on top of it. So basically one state runs in higher privilege mode than the other. But the observation that's very relevant to this one is that, well, security state, yeah, it is different, but the physical memories is still the same, right? It's the cache line. They're the same. So that sort of brings us to the idea that, okay, it controls the trusted execution environment, a security state, but physical memories is still the same and shared between two different worlds. Cool. So if we can't really go to a security state architecturally, we go in a lower level. So to refresh your memory, as you remember from previous side of the talk, that we can change this race condition, right, through aging. And that also means the previous one was intentionally encoding data. Now this one is unintentionally letting someone else's data get encoded in the analog layer. Okay, so here's the high-level sort of overarching threat model that an adversary has a physical access to it, to a device, and is backed by trusted execution environment like Trust Zone. and I'll show you 3 different attack scenarios that I built on top of this idea. First of all, there are a bunch of challenges we need to address, and we already did in the previous sort of project. First of all, you have to be able to accelerate the aging. For that, you need to have access to the power bus, and it can be done by manipulating the power supply a little bit, just removing the inductor and probing it in there with a specific voltage for that particular SoC. And then you have to be able to read this power in state somehow, and then of course, you have to be able to stop system from sort of contaminating these states so that you can actually exfiltrate whatever secret you're going after. Here's my test platform. I had to do a complicated setup because a ton of chips we needed to test for publication, of course. But it's not that complicated, really. If you have a probe with if you have a power supply and it has some voltage knob, you just set it to a specific voltage and then probe it and just let it sit there if you don't have temperature. If you want to use temperature as well, just solder a little bit of, one wire to it and throw it in the oven. Cool. It'll work. So in the first scenario, assume that a normal world application, so requesting service from a secure world application, it has crypto engine and keys and everything that stays in the SRAM. But if you execute the attack like the way I described, you elevate the voltage and you elevate the temperature and you erase the full chip. Don't expect anything to be in there, but still you can read the secure part of the SRAM. And why? Because as you remember, if you look at the power and state after exposing it to accelerated aging and complement, because it's a negative burn-in process, you can interpret what was stored in there with a very, very good accuracy, the sub 3% accuracy without any pre-characterization. But if you can pre-characterize a specific cache line, the error is much lower. It's like 8,000 on average, 8,000 key search space. It's not a lot. And just to visually show the pre-stress and post-stress memory map or the memory snapshot of this particular device. Then we move on to sort of exploiting proprietary firmware or exfiltrating proprietary firmware that runs only from the SRAM. And the idea was inspired by this work that says, well, keep data on chip and use trusted execution environment like TrustZone to sort of prevent both physical attacks and software attacks. But as you can see from here, specifically the first figure over there, data gets burned into the SRAM pretty easily, and you can go ahead and read that particular part of the SRAM area and figure out what was that particular firmware doing in there. Okay, so now let's move on to a little bit of more complicated setup where you go after cache lines instead of just memory mapped SRAM, which is, I did it on a Cortex A72 and A53, both cores, Raspberry Pi 3 and 4. So attack knobs, they remain the same. High temperature, high voltage, and stress time. But data is in the SRAM, in the cache. For this particular one, I went after L1D and L1I, both. But we have to deal with some system level problem because this cache is not directly accessible like typical memory. It's supposed to be transparent microarchitecture, right? So for that, I had to sort of inject a fake kernel that gets loaded after boot that stops the MMU from enabling and uses a coprocessor interface to dump the cache line to the system RAM. And then I can go ahead and analyze that, what's in there. Again, technically, I'm not reading the data from system. I'm reading just the unnecessary boot state of the cache. Here is a picture just for visual that shows where kind of how I did it. And this, there is another attack which I had to remove for brevity, but this one unifies everything. This one runs a full-scale AES encryption without using any RAM. It's fully on cache, secret key and everything in L1 cache. Then I expose it to accelerated aging, 93+% data I can exfiltrate using this. All right, so there are a bunch of other stuff I wanted to talk about, but I think it's afternoon, and we don't want to. But I encourage you to go look at the papers if you want to learn more. You can ask questions as well, and I'll be happy to chat offline.
All right, now there's time for some questions.
Going back to the first paper, I was wondering if you did any testing on how retrieval is affected by changes in the physical environment, like the temperature that you conducted the retrieval at.
Yes, that's a good question. Power on state is less affected by temperature, operational noise compared to other type of analog behavior like remanence, voltage, and time. But there are some cells in the SRAM that will behave differently at different temperature. If they're say powering on into logic 1, if you take it into say 50 degrees C, they will probably, some of them will power into logic 0, so you will get error. So most of the post-retrieval analysis we did it in a room temperature 20 to 25 C. Yeah.
Super interesting. Thanks. You mentioned that, I think you mentioned that the SRAM will read out slower after you encode information. Is that correct?
Not really.
Or that I thought the switching speed becomes slower?
Not really. What happens is when you age an SRAM cell, it feels like, it'll respond slower. But the data when you write to a cell, you read back at typical speed. But the race condition that settles the state that a cell going to power on as, that gets affected. But on a system level, it doesn't really have any implication, at least.
I see. So could that be used as a detection mechanism, that there's data intentionally encoded? If you start it up and stop and start and stop, and you notice that the race condition typically triggers one way rather than randomly?
That's a pretty good question. But here's the thing, though. You can't really see that race condition because the sense amplifiers, they'll give you 1 or 0. And if they're not stable right now, they're not going to give you any value. So race conditions are sort of masked.
Don't you get a 0 or 1 still? Don't you get the underlying bit after a reset? So let's say you reset the system, SRAM comes back up, and now you're just reading random bits.
Yeah. But that's settled before you get to it. If I can take you to very beginning of the slide, the race condition happens actually within few nanoseconds of powering on. You see 10 nanoseconds of powering on. You don't really see much of a difference there when it...
But you don't know, like, if I read the bit off without encoding any information, I don't know whether I'll get a 0 or 1, right? If we haven't written anything to it.
You will actually. And the reason is a lot of the cells, I know I said that sometime they will power on as 1, sometime they will power on as 0. But that's not the case. 80% of those cells will power on into a predictable state, even if you don't encode anything in it. And the reason is when you manufacture the cells, there are certain variation is introduced in the cells, even though by design they're same. That sort of dictates what is the power instead going to be. So what we're doing is that we're just trying to change that symmetry, change that property a little bit, trying to overcome that manufacturing bias. Yeah.
I see. Cool. One last question. If we then just increase the voltage, let's say, the poor 007's at the airport and, they're pulling his arms. Someone takes the chip. Can they increase the voltage to, bypass that inductor and then not go all the way to, say, the voltage levels or temperature in your paper, but go, say, halfway and then try putting data in, and then can you then detect afterwards that there was actually data encoded versus not?
If you try to encode again or try to change the sort of, hey, I'm going to try seeing how sensitive this device is to aging after elevating the voltage and temperature, maybe not temperature, just the voltage, and see how it responds, because aging is logarithmic. Initially, you'll see a lot of response. After that, it's going to taper off. So yes, if you check that level, like expose the device to aging for, say, 10 minutes and see it's not responding that much anymore, yeah, it'll say, well, this device is old. It has been used, but it doesn't necessarily mean that someone is hiding information in there.
I have also one question, actually. Is it possible to perform the attack with just temperature but not voltage in case you don't have access to like overvolting it?
Yeah, you can. They both are independent technically, but the effect of temperature on overall aging is orders of magnitudes sort of less than the voltage. So if you want to do just the temperature, it's going to take a long time.
Maybe a follow-up question. Do you think it's possible to attack fuses like that? Because from what I know, like fuses are slow. That's why they're cached. And if I then try to burn them in and then try to detect that, maybe is that easier than reading out the fuses directly in case fuses have like read protection, like anti-fuses?
I'm actually not sure how this type of device wear would affect fuses, but that's an interesting angle to look at.
Thanks.
Hey, you mentioned manufacturing variances as a good segue into this question. Have you looked at how this might impact SRAM physical unclonable functions, puffs?
I'm going to get in trouble for this. You can entirely clone a puff by doing this, 93% accurate. So, and depending on other devices, in fact, the microchip microcontroller that I used, you can do 98% clone with accuracy. So, yeah, if you, as an attacker, if you have access to the puff, yeah, that's a problem.
Right. I was wondering if this might make puffs more reliable, because I know that's some people don't like that because, I don't know if my SRAM is going to change. Right.
If you read the SRAM puffs data and then complement it, store it, it's going to strengthen the puffs response. It'll denoise actually. Yeah. It'll make it reliable.
And is there any, like, can I use an X-ray at all to see what's happened with this stressing?
I don't think so, because it's not really changing anything structurally. It's fully analog level.
Oh, thanks.
I just wanted to know, is it possible to reverse aging?
That's a very philosophical question.
It would have been cooler, actually. Yeah, I'm starting to wonder about that too. But aging is almost irreversible, as you might know, and even for devices. Once you encode information, you can inject noise in it, because not all cells respond similarly. There are variations. So if you try to reverse it by complementing the data and sort of elevating the voltage and temperature and see how that affects, it'll inject more noise, but it's not possible to entirely reverse this.
So I was wondering, like, as a practical matter, on the initial paper in the 007 case, he's trying to just steganographically encode stuff and move it across a security boundary. Like, as a practical matter of how it's implemented, is the expectation that you only influence SRAM outside of some region that you know, like the particular chip will not influence any SRAM past this point as a virtue of like its ROM coming up or something like that? So like the first code execution you get, which is where I assume, like, you didn't talk about how you actually read the initial boot state out. You talked a little bit about like at a kernel level, but I'm assuming like a firmware level with the minimal level of manipulation is what you want to do. Like as early as possible is the best place before things get tampered with. So like One, how do you, like, what is your expectation of practically when they do pull the information out? And two, does that bound the range and the maximum value of SRAM that you have available to encode stuff?
If I understand your question correctly, the first question is, could you repeat the first question again? Sorry.
So first of all, first paper, James Wan goes across to the border. How does he pull the data back out that he's encoded?
Oh, okay. So data reading actually depends on the device itself. If it is a microcontroller, it's just memory map SRAM. You have to do that from the firmware, yes, before system writes anything to it, because if system writes anything to it, it's going to go away. But if it is a ARM Cortex A-class device, you have to use coprocessor 15 interface. There are instructions that would allow you to directly go to those cache lines and read it regardless of their validity. You don't have to worry about whether they're dirty or valid, invalid, no. For A53, I believe they call it direct RAM access. For A73, they call it RAM index operation. They're the same thing as coprocessors going ahead and reading internal RAMs.
Right. So basically the two cases, either A, you grab it via firmware, or B, you grab it via coprocessor.
Yes.
And so my second question was essentially then, does that mean you basically actually only have a subset of the SRAM because the ROM or something is probably almost certainly going to touch and tamper with a certain amount of SRAM, a certain amount of L1 cache, whatever? And then how does that affect the actual, like what percentage of SRAM can you actually use on some of these things? Like, does the ROM dirty up the first, 10% of the SRAM? Does it dirty up the first 25%, 50%? How much can you actually use to encode there?
Right. You're absolutely right. Actually, ROM is going to use part of it and is going to erase after it's done. That part is not accessible. For microcontrollers, like 2 kilobyte or so is probably going to that part, especially the controllers that I tested. But for a profile processor, ROM actually doesn't do much in terms of L1 caches because, for D1 cache to be activated, you need to set up the memory controller, MMU, right? And ROM is not responsible most of the cases for that. So you'll have the whole cache for your data encoding.
Okay. And then I want to ask the complementary question to what he asked. He asked if you only used temperature. So I'm going to ask the question of if you only use voltage, but my scenario is more like in your James Bond scenario, the person encoding the information and transferring the information has the device fully under their control. I want to understand how possible it would be for a software-only adversary to turn people into unintentional data mules by basically saying, I have full arbitrary code execution on your device, and you're going to move that device across the border. I'm assuming that, I can't control the room temperature where they're staying in their hotel or something, but maybe I can control voltage to a degree of whatever degree of software over voltage type capability exists on the processor. So not like assuming I physically tamper with the voltage, but just software over volting. Is the current state of research say anything about what possibilities there are for accelerated aging using only voltage, but not assuming that you physically tamper with the voltage, but just try to use software firmware only means?
Right. So that's a great question, actually. If you have the capability to tamper, change the voltage, operating voltage of the CPU just by software interface, you can't go that high simply because the software interface will not, the processor for its protection will never allow you to go twice X the nominal temperature. But there is always a margin. You can tweak the DVFS to drive up the voltage a little bit, even the device is operating at slower speed. But right now, I don't think there is any research that does only software aging. But that's a good thing to look at. I assume the encoding time will be significantly longer.
Sure. All right. Thank you.
So it seems like the aging really is due to the manufacturing processes of how SRAM is made. What would a potential countermeasure be, and how would chip fabricators actually fix this if they could at all? And do you see that happening?
Fix the, you mean the whole aging thing or encoding thing?
Fix the fact that you can accelerate aging.
It's just a natural thing. I don't think you can really fix this in The reliability research is there. They're really trying hard so that the devices don't really age that quickly, right? But this is adversarial aging pretty much, right? I think there are better way to prevent this type of, if you want to look at from an attack angle, don't let anybody read those states. Even though for systems, they're not useful, but security researchers like you guys, you're going to figure something out for them. So that's bad. Don't let anybody read those, unless there are PUF application. Even if there is PUF, PUF application, even that is a problem. Don't let anybody read those. Yeah.
Yeah, so actually my question was echoing what's somewhat similar. Is there any recommendation published so far how to protect? I mean, chips from aging, especially low-cost chip. And a high-cost chips they already have over-voltage protection built in, or some built-in reset circuits, or ROM may erase the SRAM before start.
Yes.
But if you're talking about low-cost chip, they cost like few dollars. That's going into like embedded system, very embedded system, like automotive area, for instance. So is there any recommendation for the manufacturers how to protect against that?
Right. For low-cost chip, even if they are low-cost, they probably come with built-in self-test engines for the memories, the SRAM or other components. So I would assume using those, instead of trying to protect aging from happening, let those base controller run before releasing control to the software, so that those controller very quickly, they're going to erase everything from the SRAM. And it's not going to get you any penalty for booting, because most of those microcontrollers it's important for them to be quick and boot up fast. And if you use base controller, it's probably going to make life a lot easier than trying to figure out software solution or even from boot ROM solution.
All right. If you have more questions, we run out of time. Feel free to catch up Jubaya later. I'm sure he is happy to chat.
Yeah, absolutely.
So please give another round of applause for Jubaya.
Thank you.